At 14:56 local time in the Philippine Sea, USS Gerald R. Ford took a direct hit on the starboard side of her flight deck. The strike came from a Chinese DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle, no warhead. None was needed. The kinetic energy alone, a 1.5-ton vehicle moving at Mach 8, released the equivalent of 4 tons of TNT against the most expensive warship ever built. For the previous 9 minutes, the Aegis Combat System on 3 escort ships had fired 4 SM-6 interceptors at it. All 4 missed. This is the story of how a Chinese missile costing $11 million made $1.5 billion of American air defense look like nothing, and why the Pentagon already knows it will happen again. Carrier Strike Group 5, forward deployed from Yokosuka, operating 480 kilometers east of Okinawa, well inside the second island chain. At the center, USS Gerald R. Ford, $13.3 billion, 5,000 crew. The newest, most automated, most heavily defended aircraft carrier the United States Navy has ever put to sea. Around her, the standard outer shield, 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers, USS Higgins and USS Mustin, each with an AN/SPY-6 radar, the most advanced surface naval radar ever built. 1 Ticonderoga cruiser with full Aegis BMD capability, combined magazine of more than 200 SM-6 and SM-3 interceptors, combined cost of the air defense suite alone, over $1.5 billion. 40 years of refinement, built to stop Soviet anti-ship missiles, then Iranian ones, then Russian ones, then North Korean ones. Every missile the United States has ever planned to fight flies one of 2 ways.
Low and slow, hugging the wave tops, so phalanx and sea sparrows can hit it on the terminal approach. Or high and fast on a ballistic arc, climbing into space and falling back down, so SM-3 can intercept it at apogee. DF-17 does neither. It does something Aegis was never built to fight, and on the afternoon of the engagement, it took 4 minutes to prove that.
Here's why the whole system used to work. A ballistic missile follows a curve. You launch it, it climbs, gravity pulls it back down. Earth's gravity is fixed. The missile's velocity at separation is fixed. So the moment you see the launch on satellite, you can predict, to within a few hundred meters, where it's going to come down. Aegis isn't fast. It doesn't have to be. It's very good at solving one math problem: predict the arc. Send an interceptor to a point on that arc. Wait. For low-flying missiles, the principle is similar. The missile flies in a straight line a few meters above the water. Phalanx puts a wall of bullets in its path. In both cases, the defense works because the attacker's trajectory is predictable. The DF-17 glide vehicle does not have a predictable trajectory. It flies at Mach 8 at an altitude of 60 kilometers, too low for space-based interceptors, too high for terminal defense. And every 15 seconds, it changes direction. The launch came from a mobile transporter erector launcher concealed near Pingtan Island in Fujian Province on the Chinese mainland. DF-17, 2-stage solid propellant booster, fielded by the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force in 2019. Estimated unit cost, between $8 and $11 million per round. The launcher drives off the road, fires, and drives back into a tunnel within 9 minutes. There's nothing to bomb afterwards. The booster climbs to 60 kilometers in just under 2 minutes. At that point, the second stage separates and releases what the Pentagon calls the DF-ZF, a wedge-shaped, unpowered glide vehicle about 1.5 meters long, made of carbon-carbon composite skin that can survive surface temperatures over 2,000 degrees Celsius. The DF-ZF has no engine after separation. It doesn't need one. At Mach 8, the friction of the upper atmosphere does the lifting. It glides. The Defense Support Program satellite over the Pacific picked up the booster's exhaust plume the instant it left the launcher. The infrared cue arrived at North American Aerospace Defense Command, was routed through U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and was on Lieutenant Commander David Park's console aboard USS Gerald R. Ford 14 seconds later. Park is a former Aegis console operator, 11 years in the Navy. He's run hundreds of intercept drills, mostly against Russian and North Korean ballistic profiles. What appeared on his screen that afternoon was not a ballistic profile. It was an arc that started like a ballistic launch. And then, at the boost stage cutoff, the arc just stopped curving. The track flattened, it leveled, and it kept going. Park said one word to the tactical action officer next to him: glide. For the next 4 minutes, the most expensive air defense system in the world could see the DF-ZF, identify it as a hostile track, and do absolutely nothing about it. The reason is geometry. Aegis Combat System Baseline 10, the version installed on Ford's escorts, is built around a single planning assumption. When you detect a missile, you fire your interceptor at the point in space where the missile will be at the moment of impact. You don't aim at where it is, you aim at where it will be. For a ballistic missile, this works because the path is fixed by physics. For a cruise missile, this works because the path is straight. For the DF-ZF, this doesn't work. Because every 15 to 20 seconds, the vehicle uses its body lift to bank, change heading, and pick a new approach vector. The intercept point you calculated 5 seconds ago is now wrong. You can compensate by firing later when the vehicle is closer. But at Mach 8, every second of delay costs you 2.5 kilometers of standoff distance. By the time you can predict the next maneuver reliably, the DF-ZF is already inside the engagement envelope of your last-ditch defense. 8 minutes 30 seconds after launch, Aegis on USS Higgins fired its first SM-6 Block IB interceptor. $4.3 million per round. The fastest air defense missile in the United States Navy. The DF-ZF banked 12 degrees to port at the same moment. The SM-6 missed by 400 meters. It would not be the only one. USS Higgins fired again. 2 more SM-6s in a salvo, this time leading the predicted maneuver rather than the current track. The DF-ZF entered plasma blackout. At Mach 8 in the lower stratosphere, the air in front of the vehicle ionizes. It becomes a sheath of plasma at around 1,500 degrees Celsius. For roughly 9 seconds, the SPY-6 radars on Higgins and Muston lost the return entirely. The track went from a solid contact to a maintained estimate to nothing. When the plasma cleared, the DF-ZF was 3 kilometers off its predicted position. Both SM-6s went ballistic and self-destructed. USS Muston fired her own pair, same result. The plasma sheath returned. The track was lost. The interceptors had no target to home on. In 90 seconds, the carrier strike group expended 4 SM-6 interceptors. $17 million of ordnance. None of them came within 500 meters of the inbound vehicle. Park watched the track on the Aegis console approach the inner defensive layer. At 80 kilometers from USS Gerald R. Ford, Phalanx spun up. 2,000 rounds per minute, 20mm tungsten penetrators, the last line. Phalanx reaction time, from initial track to first round down range, is 2.5 seconds. At Mach 8, the DF-ZF crossed the Phalanx engagement envelope in 1.2 seconds. By the time the first tungsten round left the barrel, the vehicle was already past it. Park's last log entry, timestamped 14:55:58, read, "Inbound, no intercept available." 6 seconds later, the impact happened. 3 things, working together, make the DF-17 currently uninterceptable. Not difficult, not expensive, uninterceptable, given the systems the United States Navy has on its ships right now. First, the altitude. 60 kilometers is the dead zone of Western air defense. below the orbital interceptors, above the terminal ones. Every existing U.S. system was built for one or the other, not the middle. Second, the maneuver. A ballistic missile arrives where geometry says it will arrive. A glide vehicle arrives where the engineers programmed it to arrive. Whichever direction the engagement asks for, 15 seconds before impact. Third, the speed. At Mach 8, the engagement window for any layered defense collapses to under 2 seconds in the terminal phase. CIWS needs 2.5. SM2 needs 4. The math doesn't close. Aegis costs over $1 billion per ship. 40 years of refinement. The DF-17 makes it irrelevant, not by being better, by flying somewhere the defense was never designed to look. The DF-ZF struck frame 78 on the starboard side of Ford's flight deck, 3 meters forward of Catapult 2. There was no explosion in the conventional sense. The vehicle had no warhead. What it had was speed. And when you decelerate 1.5 tons from Mach 8 to 0 in less than a millisecond, the kinetic energy comes out as heat, light, and pressure. 4 tons of TNT equivalent. Concentrated in a hole the size of a dinner plate, drilled cleanly through the flight deck, the hangar deck below it, and the second compartment below that. 3 F/A-18 Super Hornets on the deck were destroyed by the impact spalling. 23 sailors were injured, 6 seriously. Catapult 2 was disabled. The forward elevator was jammed by hydraulic damage on the deck below. USS Gerald R. Ford did not sink. She was not in danger of sinking. But for the next 19 days, she couldn't conduct flight operations.
The most expensive warship in the world had been pulled out of the fight by one missile. The Chinese DF-17 launcher that fired the shot drove back into its tunnel in 7 minutes. It was never targeted. 3 weeks later, in classified testimony, the Vice Chief of Naval Operations told the Senate Armed Services Committee that the Navy had begun an emergency program to develop a counter to the DF-17 class. That program will not produce a deployable interceptor until 2032 at the earliest. Until then, the Pacific has a hole in it.
Every weapon the United States Navy has ever planned to defeat, submarine, cruise missile, ballistic missile, drone swarm, has obeyed a set of rules. The rules are physics. Pressures, altitudes, speeds. If you know the rules, you can build a wall. The DF-17 doesn't break the rules. It uses a different set of them. It flies in a zone the wall doesn't reach. It moves on a path the wall can't predict. It arrives at a speed the wall can't react to. You can spend $1 billion per ship on a wall. You can spend 40 years perfecting it. None of it matters when the threat doesn't fly by your rules. The Pentagon knows this. The Navy knows this. China knows that they know. That's the part that should keep you up.